That literally and visually was a trip. Now, I'm sure most of you have seen that effect before. But how does this marvelous high-tech geographical application relate to Rocky Mountain House? You'll find out soon enough. Hi, I'm Henry Gauthier, and right off the top, let's clear up some confusion about the name Rocky Mountain House. It never was a house per se. It was a trading post, a fort. And actually, 4 forts were built in the area between 1799 and 1875, all called Rocky Mountain House. I think it had something to do with not wanting to fill out those change of address cards. These 2 fireplace chimneys from the last Rocky Mountain House are the only structural evidence left of any of the 4 forts. If you look closely at other locations, traces do exist. But to truly appreciate this rich National Historic Site, you have to experience it through your senses. And imagine what was once here. For 76 years, Rocky Mountain House played an important role in the history of the North American fur trade. Its fascinating story is a mixture of truth and legend about isolation, fierce competition, cultural dependence, Western exploration, and globalization in the 19th century. But above all, it's a story about people. It all began in 1799, when the Northwest Company traveled up the historic North Saskatchewan River and set up the westernmost fur trading outpost. They came here in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains to establish trade with the Kootenai First Peoples, who lived on the other side of the mountains. They called their post Rocky Mountain House, and they built it right here. At the same time as the Northwest Company, or the Nor'westers, were setting up shop, their biggest rivals, the Hudson's Bay Company, moved into the neighborhood, built their post within sight of Rocky Mountain House, and called it Acton House. When one company made a move, the other tried to follow suit to attract the same business, much like the commercial maneuvering of today. To put it in perspective, it would be like Canada's most popular coffee chain setting up right beside the second most popular. Both the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company were here for the furs, and especially the beaver pelts, which were in great demand by European hat makers. But would there be enough furs to keep both posts operating profitably? Could 2 rival companies exist so close to each other without taking up arms against one another? Could they keep the 9 or so Aboriginal peoples they hoped to trade with happy, even after the Blackfoot-speaking peoples prevented the Kootenays from trading with the new kids in town? You see, the Blackfoot had been acting as middlemen and controlled what trade goods the Kootenays and their allies could buy, keeping things like guns for themselves. They did not want this arrangement to change anytime soon. Now let's try to imagine what it would take for the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company to set up a fur trading network today. Would it be as successful as it was 200 years ago? Joining me now is Jonathan Dewar, a doctoral student in Canadian Studies. Jonathan, tell me a little bit about the complexities of the fur trade when the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company set up shop.
Okay, well, the first and I think obvious complexity is the fact that we're talking about an immense period of history here. Generation upon generation of trade. There were complex systems of trade in place between First Peoples, and Europeans stepped into that complexity. From the earliest point of contact, First Nations peoples dictated the terms of trade. Not only did they know the trade routes, not only did they know how to deal with other First Nations in the area, but they knew what they wanted. And one of the interesting things that I think people often overlook is that it took the French and the English and later the companies many years, sometimes generations, to figure out how these things worked. Yes, the Europeans did bring new goods. The introduction of European goods, of course, vastly altered trade, vastly altered the history of all of Canada's founding peoples, the English, the French, and of course, First Nations.
Joining me now is Rob Woisman from the Marketing Works. Rob, how would it be different today marketing and distributing this type of product compared to the 1800s?
It would be very, very different and also very similar. On an economic level, it's still a supply and demand business. What's really changed over time is just the sheer speed and complexity of marketing and distribution. What used to be years to get a fur into market is weeks nowadays. What used to be years to find out whether buyers liked what you had now takes days to find out whether products sold. In the 1800s, of course, everything was slow. Trappers would send their products into the auction system. They would disappear for months, years sometimes. They'd never know what finally happened. Communications. Nowadays, word of mouth and the speed of the internet means that the complexity of even marketing is different. In the day, basically we had print advertising. Nowadays, there are so many different channels that we can use to promote and communicate with our buyers.
Has the product itself changed at all?
A little bit. Most of the furs, of course, 200 or 300 years ago were trapped. Nowadays, a great deal of the industry is farmed. So there's even a different source of supply, but at the end of the day, it's still supply and demand and auction based.
With a load capacity of more than 40 tons and the ability to haul furs across the country in less than 3 days, one of these babies would have cut the Nor'westers and HBC's journey from Rocky Mountain House to the East Coast down by 85 days. And they could pack 1 year's worth of fur pelts for the European market in its container.
Are we there yet?
We are here,
Yeah.
and we need to get here.
Oh, my companion, who's not paddling, by the way, is Parks Canada historian Scott Stephen. So basically, this is how they move the furs, right?
Yep.
Oh.
Scott, that's really a lot of hard work. Was it always like this?
I'm afraid so. The fur trade was not an easy job. Those men would be out on the rivers from dawn till dusk, days in a row, 6 to 8 weeks all the way to Hudson Bay. Even longer if they were going all the way to Montreal.
And was it always by canoe?
No, the Hudson's Bay Company would use York boats, which are wooden boats, and both companies would sometimes use pack trains with horses or oxen. But they always preferred to use the river because it was, believe it or not, easier.
Trading with the First Nations was done mostly in the winter. The goods to be traded and the basic necessities for survival arrived at the forts by boat brigades in the fall. For the fort's inhabitants, this was not an easy or exciting life. Boredom ruled the day. The isolation and hardships during the long, dreary winter were often too much to take. Trade with the Blackfoot people was steady, but the Nor'westers still wanted to deal with the Kootenays on the other side of the Rockies. Enter David Thompson, a 37-year-old trader, mapmaker, explorer, writer, and former employee of the Hudson's Bay Company. In the spring of 1807, Thompson left Rocky Mountain House with his wife Charlotte, 3 young children, and a party of men. They crossed the Rockies through Howe's Pass, established a new trading post on BC's Columbia River, and called it Kootenay House. Using only a sextant and a compass, Thompson created some of the earliest detailed maps of Western Canada and the northwestern US. In his lifetime, he traveled more than 100,000 kilometers through treacherous snow-capped mountain passes, inhospitable bug-infested terrain, and down raging rivers. And he did much of this, surprisingly enough, with his family in tow. Ready?
Ready.
I've got this.
How did Thompson do it? Hey, it's Scott. Look, everyone, it's Scott.
Scott.
Let's follow Scott. He works here. He knows where to go. Come on, everyone. Look, it's Scott. Scott, I find it incredible that Thompson managed to travel more than 100,000 kilometers in his lifetime. Can you tell me a little bit about how difficult it was to do what he managed to do?
Oh, it's incredibly difficult, especially when you consider where he started from. He had only a fairly basic mathematical education at a charity school in England before he came out to the fur trade at the age of 14. And yet, the maps he produced were not surpassed for accuracy in some cases until late 1800s, early 1900s.
That's incredible. Now, at one point, there was a tribe that threatened Mr. Thompson's life.
What was happening was that the Northwest Company, who David Thompson was working for then, wanted to get across the Rocky Mountains and start trading with the Ktunaxa or Kootenai First Nations. But the Piegan were very keen not to let them across the Rocky Mountains. They set up a blockade of the Has Pass, and no one got through. At one point, according to one account, David Thompson was actually hiding in the bush with some of his men and some of his goods, afraid for his life. No great wonder then that his employers told him to find another way across the mountains, and that's when he found Athabasca Pass. And for the rest of the fur trade, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company went through those northern passes and never came back to Has Pass.
Okay, we turn left on 4th and then 3 blocks that way.
Joining me now is Yvan Daisy from Natural Resources Canada. Yvan, how has cartography evolved since David Thompson was making maps using only a compass and a sextant?
Cartography has evolved tremendously through advances in technology. You could say that we've gone from mules and horses to satellites, and in between there was all kinds of technological advances. Advances in aerial photography. Satellites have evolved to the point where we can now provide positioning from satellites, the global positioning system, but also capture imagery from the ground. And through sophisticated software, geographic information systems, we can now analyze this information and generate maps not only in paper but in digital form. And these digital maps can now be embedded in all kinds of portable devices such as phones and mobile GPS equipment that also have a map display in addition to providing the position. Precision is not an issue nowadays, but it was very much so back then.
By 1821, Rocky Mountain House and Acton House were struggling to stay in business. The intense competition between the two companies was driving both into bankruptcy. That year, the two companies decided to merge as the Hudson Bay Company. With amalgamation, 2 forts were no longer necessary. One was closed. Which one it was remains a mystery, but what we do know is that the one that remained open kept the Nor'westers' name of Rocky Mountain House. Rocky opened and closed and went boom or bust, depending on the fickle nature of the fur trade. Although there were always some Cree and Stoney customers, Rocky lived or died by the Blackfoot trade. And no other people had more to do with Rocky Mountain House than the Piegan. When they and their other regular First Nation customers came to trade, Rocky prospered. When they didn't come, it shut down. sometimes for years on end. In good times, Rocky was the most profitable trading post in the district. As the years passed, the old post became too dilapidated to be repaired. So a new Rocky Mountain house was built right here in 1835, a little downstream from the two others. And how do we know that it was five-sided? From a sketch drawn by artist Paul Kane, who spent time at Rocky sketching First Nations people. Kane left us with the only images of the third Rocky Mountain house. Rocky played host to many other visitors to the territory, such as Methodist and Roman Catholic missionaries, a scientific expedition led by Captain Palliser, and the pioneer photographer Charles Heretsky, whose haunting photograph of first people gathered at the fort is the only one that exists. By 1861, things at Rocky Mountain House had gone from bad to worse. For some unknown reason, relations with the Blackfoot went sour. After a winter of high tension, the fort was abandoned. And the following fall, it was discovered that it had been burnt to the ground. For 3 years, there was no Rocky Mountain House. Then in 1864, plans were made to build a new fort, something that would be bigger and grander than anything ever built here before. It took 4 years to complete, and like a new mall grand opening, it attracted a large number of Blackfoot. But its popularity was short-lived. By the early 1870s, times were changing. Steamboats on the Missouri River brought cheaper and more plentiful U.S. goods to trade with the Blackfoot. And independent whiskey traders were building posts on Canadian soil in the Blackfoot territory, since the Hudson Bay Company no longer offered liquor as an item for trade. With this, and the low prices and the convenience that the Americans were offering, the writing was on the wall for the Hudson Bay Company. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In 1875, Rocky Mountain House closed for the last time. Some of its buildings were dismantled, and the lumber was floated downriver to be used at Fort Edmonton. Quietly, Rocky Mountain House disappeared off the map, only to be revived once again some 30 years later, as the surrounding area became settled. The locals wanted to preserve their region's colorful past, which included Rocky Mountain House. In 1931, Rocky Mountain House became Alberta's first designated National Historic Site. And in 1979, its Visitor Reception Center opened its doors to the public. The forts are long gone, but the stories of the people who worked, traded, lived, and died here live on.